sincerely thank Narendar Pani for being present on this occasion. We've already had to reschedule his seminars twice. First, because of the onset of the COVID-19 pandemic, which required that our in-person seminars move to a virtual format, which took some time. And second, because of some additional confusion on our side. And he has been extraordinarily patient, I must say. So we are really deeply grateful to you for allowing us to string you along in this way and still quite generously speaking to us on this occasion, 6 months later than you were originally meant to do so. The second thing I want to do is to introduce Professor Pani. Let me mention that he's the Dean of the School of Social Sciences at the National Institute of Advanced Studies in Bengaluru, India, which is a very distinguished and special institution. In addition, he heads the Inequality and Human Development Program at the Institute. But in addition to being an academic, which he has been for many decades, having started his career at the Indian Institute of Management, or IIM in Bengaluru, he's also spent quite a lot of time doing other things, including being a senior figure in the Indian media, where he has been, among other things, senior editor of the Economic Times, one of the leading business newspapers in India and in Asia. And he has won various journalism awards, including the Citibank Pan-Asia Journalism Award. So he has a very interesting dual career, and that might be of interest to, especially to some of our students who might be inclined to do popular writing and pursue other careers in addition to academic ones. His research spans a really very broad range of themes and interests, including, for example, Gandhian economics, issues to do with land reform, globalization and gender, the dynamics of Indian politics, and the city of Bengaluru. And in addition, I note that he has written 2 novels and a booklet on theater. So perhaps we'll learn a little bit more about that later on. So quite a Renaissance man indeed. And I certainly, on the few occasions I have met Professor Pani in Bengaluru, I have been always very impressed by his insights. And I know he's a very well-respected figure there. Let me also briefly note that today's topic is one that greatly interests me, and it should interest many of us. As all of you know, one of the big changes in the world in recent years has been that the world has become, according to UN statistics, predominantly urban for the first time. And this is a transition which has happened to different extents in different continents and countries. And India, interestingly, is one of the countries where it has progressed most slowly. Even areas of the world which have a lower income oftentimes are more urbanized, but for particular reasons, which perhaps we will hear about more, India appears to have urbanized more slowly, at the same time that the share of agriculture in the Indian economy has been falling very, very rapidly, just as it has in other developing countries due to the growth of industry and services. And I understand that Professor Pani is going to be talking about this specific circumstance. Maybe it's a paradox, maybe not, but at any rate, he'll help to explain this set of observations, among others, I gather, but I won't second guess what he will say. Let me warmly welcome you, Professor Pani, and just mention that you should speak for about 40 minutes, 30 to 45 minutes, but preferably 35 to 40 minutes, and then we'll have open discussion, questions and any comments that there might be in the first instance from students, but also the faculty, of course. So again, welcome, and please start whenever you're ready.
Thank you, Sanjay. Thank you for having me. I was looking forward to discussing an issue that we don't normally pay too much attention to, and that is the whole question of the volatility in India's growth process. There is a period when we were seen as the most rapidly growing emerging economy, and yeah, soon after the COVID crisis in the second quarter of this calendar year, we were recognized as the one as the economy that contracted the most. We in between April and June this year, our economy contracted by 23.9%, which is by far the worst among all the G20 economies. Right? Now, this process is something that we need to understand, because we tend in India, I suppose in many parts of the world, to respond to such volatility in terms of immediate causes and very often immediate political leadership and actions taken by them. But I would try to argue today that there is something more inherent in the Indian economy, a kind of structural process in the Indian economy that causes this to happen. In order to do that, I would need to take you back to the elementary development theory, going right back to the process of the movement from agriculture to industry, and hence, as is expected widely, to urbanization. I don't need to go into this other than to point out that the conventional theories uh, point to a convergence between the movement out of agriculture and the growth of urbanization. Right? I think Lewis, Fay, and Rand, I mean, Todaro, I don't need to mention any of them, but all of them sort of had an implicit movement from agriculture to industry, and a further implicit assumption that that would imply there is a process of urbanization. This assumption has been widely considered as perfectly acceptable, largely because of I think it's been strengthened by studies in new economic geography, which point to the processes of agglomeration around cities. So if there's a movement out of agriculture, it will necessarily tend towards cities. Right? And this has also been held out by data or empirical evidence from major countries across the world, notably China and Brazil, where as you have a decline in agriculture, in the share of agriculture in GDP, there's a corresponding decline in the share of the rural population to the total population. So the gap between the two ratios tends to decline over time. In the case of China, it was 60.6%, the gap between the two ratios in 1960, and it reduced to 33.7% by 2018. In the case of Brazil, it was even more stark, dropping from 36.2% in 1960 to 9.1% in 2018. In India, on the other hand, this gap has increased. Right? It was 4.8% 40.8% in 1960, and it's 51.4% in 2018. So what we are seeing really is much slower urbanization than is warranted by the decline in agriculture, in the decline the share of agriculture uh, in GDP. This is a process that is very stark. It's very clear, and what is interesting about it is that there's no indication in the longer term curves of this moving towards any convergence. The gap that we're seeing is something that has built up over the years, and it is strengthening and moving ahead, and seems to be stable and even increasing over time. Now, in order to understand why this is happening, I think we need to go back to the patterns of the pressures out of agriculture. In India, bulk of the pressure from agriculture out of agriculture, as elsewhere, comes from the changing levels of productivity. So as non-agricultural activities become more productive, it tends to absorb more labor. But what is also happening is because of the fact that India has an inheritance law where every generation shares the property of the previous generation, farm sizes get smaller and smaller with each succeeding generation. So in large parts of India, agriculture has become increasingly unviable. And as people leave agriculture, they look for non-agricultural opportunities elsewhere in the world. Now, this process has not been even. And if you look at what we have got here are two maps. The one on the left is of 2001 and on the right is of 2011. And and what we have tried to capture in these maps are the percentage of the population that does not get work for more than 6 months in a year, right? And you will see that it moves from a light yellow to a which is less than 20%. 20 to 40 is the orange or red, as it may be on your screens, and then the dark brown is above 40%. And you'll see from the two maps that by 2011, and now it's more so, the share of marginal workers, as they are called by the census, has declined towards the south, but it has increased quite substantially towards the north and the east, particularly towards the east, right? So this, if you put it into development theory, you would expect the workers to move from the areas where they're being released from agriculture to the regions where they're being absorbed into agriculture, right? And this is a process that we can try and understand as simple, in terms of very simple equation. In fact, I'm using this equation not in any predictive sense, but just to help uh, clarify the various components of this process. So it's a very simple thing. It's the real earnings in the urban areas have to be greater than the real earnings in the rural areas, plus the cost of accessing jobs in the city. These are is stated in terms that economists would understand, but at various points, these variables, as it were, are determined by factors outside what is normally not taken into economic consideration. For instance, the overall cost of accessing jobs in the city includes sometimes the costs of leaving your children with your grandparents in the village. So there are social, political, and other costs that come into play. But basically, there are five variables that come into play. That is the earning in the urban areas, the prices in the urban areas, prices relevant to the workers, the earnings in the rural areas, the prices in the rural areas, and the costs of moving from urban to the rural areas. Now, for a variety of reasons, this process of transition does not occur. This is the question that Sanjay was raising at the outset, that though agriculture has shrunk massively as a share of GDP, the urbanization has not kept pace. And that's for a variety of reasons. Uh, First of all, if you look at the whole process of earning in urban areas being greater than earning in rural areas, that is something that holds particularly in nominal terms. Right? That is, you have two kinds of growth paths in India as far as industry is concerned. You have the foreign capital led investment strategy. Some states follow that, particularly the state I belong to, Karnataka, or its neighboring state, a northern state of what was Andhra Pradesh and now is Telangana. What you find there is that you focus entirely on a few cities, you present the cities to the world like Bangalore has been presented, and you end up attracting capital to those cities. So even within the state, people who migrate to urban areas have to migrate to those cities. The other path is, of course, more dispersed based on local capital. So industrialization and multiple urban centers occurs. So states that have very high levels of urbanization are those that have dispersed industrialization. But bulk of India really focuses on a few cities, and those cities are also concentrated in some states, right? So you have the need to move towards those centers. Simultaneously, you have the issue of urban prices being greater than rural prices, right? And this is particularly in terms of the costs of urban living. Strategies for urbanization in India have tried to follow Western models. If you prefer to put it that way, or you could even say they are almost aping the West. So there is an attempt to go in for high cost infrastructure rather than the most effective infrastructure. And this uh, pushes prices in the urban areas very substantially, very often beyond the means of those who are seeking to move permanently or who no longer have a permanent livelihood in their village, right? So you have people without a permanent livelihood, but yet without an option in the urban centers either. And the third, of course, is the migration capital involved. Given levels of poverty the poorest in India very rarely migrate to the cities. They have extreme pressures there, and they typically function within what what is affordable at the village. Given these constraints on permanent migration, you would expect India to remain rural and dependent on whatever agriculture is available, right? But like many other aspects of Indian life, there's an innovation in migration as well. And the main task then is to see whether you can benefit from spatial inequality. And that's quite simply if the earning and prices are high in the urban centers, it's good to earn there, but not spend in the city. So the basic strategy, the basic principle behind migration or worker decision in migration, particularly over the last 3 decades and possibly a little before that, has been to earn in the city but spend in the village. Right? So what you try to do there is that you have a separate strategy for the city and a separate strategy for the village if you're a worker. The first consideration of the workers to try and find some way of negotiating a salary in the city. He can't or she can't do it alone, so they tend to do it in groups in terms of identity groups, which they form and move in as into the city, and the identity groups sort of negotiate with different industries and sometimes industries in different cities in order to tap work opportunities as and when they are available. Right? They also working as a group also enables them to reduce housing costs. If they are in a construction project, which is what most of them are in, they would stay on the project and they would have sheds and it's highly crowded. And even if they are not staying on the project, conditions can be, I mean, the levels of congestions can be extremely high, leading to serious issues of health as well. In addition, the workers follow a minimalist approach to consumption. They they spend on virtually nothing other than the basic food and and a mobile phone, because the mobile phone gives them the connection to the village. It also allows them, particularly the smartphone, to connect to the culture of the village, which is sometimes 1,000 kilometers and sometimes much more than that away. Right? The strategy within the village then is for them to for the keep the household in the village. Most of the earnings are transferred to the village through a number of informal systems of finance, and the village is then used as the base between urban jobs. So you do an assignment as a group, and then when you wait for the next assignment, you cannot stay in the city. There will be no place for you to stay if you're a construction worker, so you move back to your village during that period. And you over time, as generation after generation does this, the earning in the city is used to increase the influence of the identity group in the village. Right? So the course that the five variables that we have identified have taken have been quite different. In the urban earning, you get the first real exposure to volatility, because the identity group comes in as a group of workers when as they are employed as long as the assignment is there, and when the assignment is finished, as it were, they are down to zero earnings. So they start with a higher nominal earning and they drop to zero wages the moment that it's very assignment specific. So the volatility depends upon there's a volatility related to the amount of work available at any point of time. The rural learning, on the other hand, tends to be more predictable. Even if you're a small farmer dependent on rain-fed agriculture, there is the seasonal learning. You know the seasons when you get when you get a return from agriculture, and the seasons when agriculture is unviable. Right? The non agricultural wage work is extremely limited, and then there's of course also the way what I would call a self-consumption of labor. That workers come to the city, they learn basic aspects of construction, and then when they get back to the village, they use those techniques or use those technologies to develop their own houses and other elements, other construction in the village. Right? Now, urban prices are consistently above rural prices, and that main factor there is in terms of housing and land. Right, Sanjay Chakravarti has various estimates for the prices of land in rural and urban areas in different parts of India, and but you will see that using those figures that the urban land is generally about 30 to 200 times the price of rural land. So it's really a very it really is at a urban land is at a price, or urban housing is at a price that rural workers cannot even hope to absorb. There was a time when the government saw this as a major issue and had state funded housing, but much of that has sort of disappeared over the last 3 decades. So rural prices then have the advantage of housing. All workers that we have studied have a house in the rural areas. It's their own house, and it sort of forms a base that they can go back to. And since they sort of have, to the extent that they have small plots of land and are not landless, they would have the ability to produce the food they consume, or at least substantial part of the food they consume. Right. Now, the final element in which I think becomes critical at various points is the cost of mobility. The economic cost of travel is there. You're talking of very long distances at times, and cost of travel will be there unless you find informal ways of doing that, including ticketless travel. Then there's the cost of waiting for jobs in the city, which most of these workers cannot afford. There are also the social costs of being separated from the family, and the need to protect land and other interests in the village, which your being away from the village sort of makes more difficult. Right? So you have in these process, in these five variables, an impact. Several of them are affected by distance. Right? There are certain advantages. If even if you're moving to a city, you move in from an area that is not too far away. So, for instance, like if you're a seasonal, if you're dependent on seasonal earning from rain-fed agriculture, if you're moving into a city that's an overnight distance away, you have the ability to respond to the actual sort of arrival of rains on your plot of land. You get a telephone call on the mobile phone from your village, and then you go back immediately, so that you're not dependent on larger statements about rain coming or estimates of it, but you know exactly when rain has come to your small piece of land. Right? Overnight distance also helps in terms of the self consumption of food that's grown in the village. It's easier to transport food if you're able to make frequent trips to the village, and which you can do if it's just a shorter distance rather than if it is much further away. There is also the question of separation from the family. As you'll see in a minute, most of the workers come away from the family, either with the wives leaving their children behind, or sometimes just a male member alone. So when you do that, you must be able to, particularly when you leave your children with your grandparents, you need to be able to respond quickly to a health or other crisis that might emerge in the village. And the third, of course, is the protection of land interests. It must be remembered that in a large parts of India, you still have land held through informal forms of informal kind of acknowledgement by the village community. There's very little paperwork, and as you can expect, there's a certain fear of paperwork in a community that is 25-30% illiterate. Right. So there is so when you talk of computerization of land records, it confirms it at one level, but it only shifts the possibility of cheating from people who would write out the paperwork to the people who will now input the paperwork. So you input the data into the computer. So the processes remain unstable to an extent. So the protection of land interests requires a permanent presence in the village. So that you find out what's happening, you sort of benefit from gossip and other oral forms of communication rather than being dependent on the written word, which in any case you're not able to read. So this leads to two broad types of what is sometimes called circular migration. But in the context of the city and the rural areas, it's probably better seen as dualism, as having to function in two economies, two societies. In fact, if you look at it in terms of the spaces of a worker's existence, from the space of imagination to the absolute space of the land and house that he lives in or she lives in, you would have a variety of spaces where these dualism emerges. I'm not going into that today because the focus is more in just trying to identify the economic processes. So what you get here is a movement pressures in the rural areas, primarily the absence of agricultural opportunities in the dry season. So these are really for people who are close to a major city and up to an overnight distance away. The second is that you have urban opportunities for low wage husband and wife teams. They are hired as kind of as a group, though technically the man's wage is twice that of the woman, but they generally work together as teams with different tasks in the construction industry, helping with the woman typically as a support for the man within that process. And then you have the limited social and land costs of short term migration. So your migration capital that you need is relatively low. So this is something that the poorer groups find affordable. It's a form of migration that small farmers can take in the dry season, move over, and then come back. Right. On the other hand, you have the at the same time a movement from the city when you have to come back to the village, and that's if there is rain. Once there's rain in the village, and you have a small plot of land that's viable during the time of rain, you just return to the village for that. At the end of an urban assignment, in any case, you have to return to the village because you cannot afford to stay in the city. And then there is the children and other family interests in the village. And then, as I said, there is the land and other material interests that have to be protected in the village. And if you're not, in fact, we did a survey of a group of 180 80 workers, out of which about more than 100 were from nearby, within overnight distance from Bangalore, and up to I think around 58% of them had never been to school. So the illiteracy is a major factor in this whole process. But this is I'm calling it urbanized seasonal dualism because it is directed, it is propelled by the existence of urban opportunities, but it is determined by rural agricultural seasons. Right? When you're further away and you're facing greater marginal conditional marginal work towards the north and the east of India, as we noted in our maps earlier, then there are very limited work opportunities in the village. Agriculture has collapsed. Most of the village has moved out of agriculture. In these regions, you'll find in our sample of these regions, typically it was around 20 to 25% of the households were in agriculture, which is certainly not enough to keep the economy going. So you have very limited work opportunities in the village. And then you have an effort to move out and seek urban opportunities. You cannot do it alone. So typically, the household links up with others who they know, typically in their caste or other identity groups. Muslims also tend to function more dependent on their religion rather than caste, but even there you'll find tendency to concentrate on specific groups like the Ansaris rather than Muslims as a whole. So you have a tendency there to basically have identity-based groups. Those identity-based groups come to the city and sort of function, uh, sort of bargain, get their work opportunities, and function there. And the family structures then alter to suit this process. Because of the distance and the long periods that they have to travel and stay away, women are not considered for this option. It's entirely a male kind of an option. And these large worker groups consist of young men. An average age in our sample was about 23 years old. So that's the kind of process that takes them to the city. And once they are in the city, they can only stay there as long as their urban assignment is there. They cannot afford to stay any longer. They have come from an even poorer part of the country, so the migration capital is even less. Right? They have the self-consumption of labor, which they take back. Whatever skills they learn in the city, they try to convert it into improving living conditions within the village. That can run into other local pressures. For instance, some of them who earn money tried to buy some land in the village, but because they were not they were from the relatively lower caste, they were not allowed to buy that land. And so as a result, they had to keep building on top the house they already had. So you have these small plots going up several stories in a village which otherwise has ample land around it. Right? You also have to retain control of your family, because in areas where men move out and then the question is who's the head of the household, that becomes a critical factor. And if you ask them in this region, they will still refer to the male, whereas in regions where people have tried to move permanently out of the village. When the man goes out in search of work, the woman asserts herself as the head of the family. So you get different patterns that emerge there, and a need to get back to assert that dominance over the family. And then, of course, what is more recent is that you're seeing groups, since they've gone out as identity groups, they come back and they use that identity, the enhanced earnings from the city to increase the status of that identity group and sometimes even win panchayat elections, or that is the local elections of the local village office, so that they are able uh, uh, to assert themselves in that process as well. So this I'm calling structural dualism because it involves a change in the structure of the family. It allows just the males to work and then maintain younger males to work. So over time, you will find a rotation of the people who are working. The younger males come in, and by the time they're 40, they tend to sort of stay on in the household, take on responsibilities within the village, including protecting whatever land or other assets there may be. And then you have the younger males moving out to the city in search of work. So what happens here is that this has several fundamental. This process is large enough to have fundamental effects on worker interests in the city, worker interest as a whole in India. The first is it most traditionally you would expect worker interest to be protected by trade unions, and it's seen as a negotiation between workers and management. And the worker strength comes occasionally, but very frequently from the ability to strike. Whether they strike or not, the fact is that they can assert their power to a strike. But once workers come in from outside in identity groups of various kinds, they are now the sole processes of negotiation occur through the identity groups. So you have there are negotiations between representatives of identity groups and managements. So the worker's strength comes not from the ability to strike, but from the ability to move to another employer. And since in any case they are from 1,000 or 1,500 and sometimes 2,000 kilometers away, their ability to one city for them is as good or as bad as another. So their options really are not confined to employers within the same city, but very often connect with employers across cities. So they can move from across very different cities with very different kind of processes and manage to get what they think is the best deal. It must be stressed that this option does not get them into wages that are anywhere near what the organized workforce has, or even workers who come in and who have been in the city for some years, who have managed to live in the city, have the minimum resources to live in the city, even they get better wages. But the fact is, among the low wage opportunities, they can move from one to another and try and get what is the best of a bad, make the best of a bad bargain, right? Now, this for the urban center as a whole leads to a link between a formal and the informal. Right? You have unskilled and semi-skilled work increasingly being transferred to identity group-based labor. In even in a city like Bangalore, it's present. It is presented as a modern, IT-friendly city across the world, but bulk of its security and uh, uh, within the factories, the security groups or those in charge of security in the factories are largely done through workers from identity groups from distant lands. It's preferred also because they don't have the ability to negotiate, they don't have the ability to unionize. So you have a transfer of the lower ends of jobs into the informal. So the you get an integration of the formal and the informal. What looks like the formal sector has a very substantial portion of the informal built into it, right? And this has an impact when such large numbers of workers are mobilized through identity. It strengthens identity politics. So what you get here, and this is something of course that is being noticed across the world, where identity politicians, if you can call them that, are able to are seen as representing worker interests, are being very attractive to increasingly attractive to workers. And the causes could be different. I'm not for a moment saying the working class support that Donald Trump has got anything to do with the processes we are talking about. But in India, certainly the existence of this dualism and identity based workers groups has strengthened the process of workers being mobilized through identity. At the same time, the village begins to function as a safety net, right? You have in urbanized seasonal dualism, you have the idea of the whatever limited earnings the village offers on your land, it becomes an effective base for you to return when urban opportunities are not there. It also interestingly provides a stability for children as parents move from village to city and back. The children grow up in their grandparents' house or what is the traditional home. So there's a certain level of stability in their lives which is brought about. And that also links up to the possibilities of school education, which would be difficult when they are just migrant workers without a permanent residence in the city. Right? In structural dualism, that's where workers leave bulk of the family and just the young men come out and work. So it acts as a base. The village still is a safety net as a base between urban assignments. The village household is also acts as a source of stability. During the COVID crisis, as soon as it was clear that the crisis, when the shutdowns were announced, people just tried to get back, if need be, trying to walk 1,500 kilometers to reach their villages because they had no home that they could stay in the city, and certainly no, in addition to not having a means of livelihood. Mm. The village household acts as a source of complete stability, and largely due to the permanence of the shelter, and also the fact that no matter what happens, you can always go back there. So, this process of what I'm calling distance dualism, that's a dualism that comes from, which varies according to the distance involved, all right, has basically several effects on the volatility and the availability of labor. In the seasonal agriculture, of course, the volatility or the increase or decrease in labor is linked to the agricultural season and is predictable. But you can have volatilities due to externalities. The COVID crisis is the most recent one, but even without that, you can have ethnic conflicts, and you had overnight people are like there was a crisis in Bangalore, just a fear of being attacked. The people of the northeast of India felt they were being threatened and were going to be attacked. In a matter of 2 days, thousands of them sort of made tried to get back to their homes around 2,000 kilometers away, uh, uh, with their own stresses, strains, and events that occur in such a process. So, and this becomes more difficult as the distance increases, where you need to can't just sort of walk 100 kilometers is bad enough, but to find way to travel 2,000 kilometers when everything is shut down is extreme cruelty. Right? The second aspect of volatility that comes into this process is that of in skills. There's a volatility in skills. The whole process of training becomes informal, and it is within an identity group. So if you're going to be a barbender, any construction task, you're taught within that. And as the people function who are being sent out in these groups change within a family, you're not even certain that the skill will be there in the group over a period of time. Right? And then, of course, there is the volatility in labor costs. Depending on periods when there's a shortage of labor, wages would go up, and otherwise they would slump. So you have a process of volatility, and this volatility is extremely the growth that then occurs is extremely sensitive to external shocks. If there's any external shock, social, political, the growth occurs that affects the mobility of labor or the sense of security of labor, then you immediately have a process, have a pressure on them that leads to a disruption of growth. Now, this normally occurs in small places in different parts of a large country, so it goes unnoticed. But when it occurs on a large scale, a factor that affects the country as a whole, as in the case of of the COVID crisis, then you have a problem of a national level slump. And as I said, the Indian economy contracted by 23.9% between April and June this year. Right. So basically, I'd just like to end by looking at the overall effects on growth. Uh, the first is, of course, the impact of volatility on growth. Any growth strategy that functions would like to have labor costs that are constant or as close to constancy as you can go with. The second is that the rural safety net is a safety net of a absolute minimum, that you have a roof over your head and some basic food for survival. But it is something that there's very little scope for rural growth because agriculture has collapsed. So the ability to absorb or provide sufficient kind of resources for anybody who's left in that safety net is very, very low. There's also virtually no health infrastructure. There are some states which are are exceptional. Kerala is one of them. There are some others which are also that have invested somewhat in health, Tamil Nadu and places like that. But they are really the exception. For the bulk of the people involved in dualism from the areas dominated by marginal workers in the north and the east of the country, the health infrastructure is abysmal. Right? And the costs of you have low wage labor, but as you increase distance, the cost of traveling that distance raises these costs. These costs may seem relatively limited when compared to the high costs of unionized labor or high wages of unionized labor. But compared to what is available in other countries that low wage cost industries are competing with, like Bangladesh, you have a process of, you tend to lose the cost advantage with them. So India has had a kind, I know the term K-shaped is being used for the idea of a recovery from the COVID crisis, but India has arguably is going through a process of a much more structured K-shaped growth itself, where on the one hand you have a focus on high-tech industry with urbanization and urban support, which you hear about globally, and which ensures that in good years your growth rate can be very high. On the other hand, you have the loss of the low cost advantage to neighboring countries, including Bangladesh. This year, after the COVID crisis, for the first time, the per capita income of Bangladesh will be higher than that of India. And so that uh, is a sense of how much pressure, the divergence between the share of agriculture in GDP and the share of the rural population can make. So I think it's important for us to spend a little time discussing the impact of dualism on growth. Thank you for your time and patience.
Thank